Good evening, everyone, and welcome to In the Adirondack Library. I'm Liz Bellier, Public Programs Manager here at the Adirondack Experience, the museum on Blue Mountain Lake. The Adirondack Experience Library is the largest and most comprehensive repository of books, manuscripts, maps, photographs, and government documents related to Adirondack history. Through this series, we invite you inside the library stacks into the people, places, and spirited conversations that have shaped life in the North Country. In the Adirondack Library runs from October through May, with gatherings on the first Monday of each month. You can find upcoming dates and details about each speaker at theadkx.org. We are also delighted to continue our partnership for this series with North Country Public Radio and to welcome back Mitch Teich, station manager at NCPR and host of North Words. Mitch's conversations remind us why the stories of the North Country continue to inspire us, challenge us, and endure. And tonight we are especially pleased to welcome two distinguished guests, Dr. Curt Stager and Dave Fadden, who join us to discuss their book, The First Adirondackers, 12,000 Years of Indigenous Peoples in the Adirondack Uplands. Curt Stager is a professor of natural sciences at Paul Smith's College and a noted author whose work bridges science, history, and storytelling. With a deep curiosity about the natural world and a gift for making complex ideas accessible, he has spent decades helping readers better understand the Adirondacks and the forces that have shaped them. And Dave Fadden is a Mohawk artist and cultural educator from the Akwesasne community and the director of the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center in Onchioda. Through his leadership, artwork, and educational work, Dave has dedicated his career to preserving and sharing Indigenous history, culture, and perspective. In the First Adirondackers, Curt and Dave bring together archaeology, ecology, and Indigenous knowledge to illuminate a sweeping and often overlooked history, one that reaches back thousands of years. Their book invites us to consider those who first lived in these mountains and how they adapted, thrived, and left a lasting imprint on the landscape that we know today. In just a moment, I will turn things over to Dave and Curt to discuss the book. Mitch will lead tonight's conversation, and afterwards we will open the floor to your questions. Please submit questions through the Q&A feature and keep an eye on the chat for helpful links throughout the evening. For now, settle in and enjoy tonight's conversation. And with that, Dave, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much. Pleased to hear there's a decent turnout. I wish I could see all your faces, but this will have to do. I think what I'll do tonight is give a little backstory about my upbringing in the Adirondacks. My family's from the Akwesasne Mohawk Reserve, and that's right along the border with Canada, right on the St. Lawrence River, and that's where I'm speaking from today. I grew up in Onchioda, and if those not familiar, it's a little bit north of Saranac Lake. It's one of those little hamlets that if you're driving by and you blink, you've gone past it. But I was born in Lake Placid, and I went to schools in Saranac Lake, and so I grew up in Onchioda. And I was very fortunate to grow up right next door to my grandparents, Ray and Christine Fadden. And my grandfather, Ray, established the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center back in 1954. And his mission back then, and it still holds true today, is one about education, learning and sharing our culture with visitors from all over the globe. We get people from Europe. I've had folks from Africa. A nice conversation with folks from Siberia. So I've met people from all over the world in this little tiny hamlet in the heart of the Adirondacks. And our mission there, again, is all about education and sharing our culture. And one of the reasons my grandfather started the museum was to help alleviate some of the misconceptions and stereotypes that exist when it pertains to Indigenous people, and specifically the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Six Nations people, who once occupied what is now New York State. And so a lot of the misconceptions and stereotypes around his time were pretty bad. It was he was born in 1910, and 20 years before he was born was year 1890, and that was the massacre at Wounded Knee, where the United States Cavalry opened up on Lakota's camp, and hundreds of innocent Lakota men, women, and children were massacred. And that, by the way, was the most medals of honor ever awarded in United States history, and they have since been rescinded. So attitudes towards Indigenous people back then was at an all-time low. And thanks to the media and the film industry, the portrayal of Indigenous people in those days was really bad. And my grandfather took it upon himself to do something about it. And so he was a school teacher at the Mohawk Reservation here at the Mohawk School in Hogansburg. And he started by teaching our own kids the truth, the true history of Indigenous people. And also back in those days was the time of residential schools. And that was a policy the United States and Canada had towards forced assimilation of Indigenous people. And how you do that is you take their children, and anything cultural uh, is shunned. Uh, Even physically, their hair, if they had long hair, it was cut. If they had traditional clothing, they were stripped and they put on a military uniform. And those things are superficial, but what was damaging was they forbid them to speak their own language and practice any parts of their culture. So a lot of the culture was disappearing during that era. And so he was determined to preserve the history, the culture of our people. And so he couldn't do it out in the open in the beginning, in the early days. And he actually had to kind of go underground to teach the true history and a little bit of the culture. And so 1954, he established the Six Nations Museum. And we have since become a not-for-profit in 2020, and we're now called the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center. But our mission is the same. And one of the things that was consistent that I've witnessed my whole life at this small museum in Acheota was a common narrative, and that was that Indigenous people didn't live in the Adirondacks. And that never sat well with me my whole life. And one reason is like I'm a Mohawk and I lived there year round too. Why wouldn't my ancestors live there? It just didn't make sense to me. And in our small museum, our collection, we have artifacts that were found locally in the Adirondacks, simply by accident. And so that narrative was persistent through the decades that Native people didn't live here and they were just either passing through or it was a hunting ground. And I can remember my dad, the way he described it as it was probably similar to the demographics of today. Like in the warmer months, you have people that come up from the cities and they have a place in the Adirondacks and they stay during the warmer months. In the colder months, they go back to the city. But there's some hardy folk that stay year round. And I think the population of the Adirondacks probably gets cut in half as soon as the snow starts to fall. But those people would come back in the warmer months. And why wouldn't it be similar, 1,000 years ago? You get some folks that, certain areas where there's good hunting or good fishing, certain berries and plants, edibles. You harvest certain times of the year. You move around. And maybe the main villages are near water, just like today, the main cities are near waterways. Why wouldn't some people want to stay there year round? Because it's beautiful. It might be biased, but I think it's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And there's a certain connection that I have to the Adirondacks that's my home. And it will always be my home. And I can't see my ancestors thinking any different. And so that's one of the misconceptions that has permeated through the decades, and that we didn't live in the mountains. And it, again, that just never sat well with me. And I met Curt a number of years ago, and he could talk more about this, but we worked on a project together with the Lake Champlain Basin program. And it was during this project that we teamed artists with scientists to address the issue of pollution and water quality in Lake Champlain specifically. And so with this project, as an artist, I'm a painter as well. And it brought me back to my childhood again when behind our house where I grew up, there's a little stream, a little brook called John Thomas Brook. And me and my dad, this one day went down the trail down to the brook. And like any kid, I threw sticks into the water to watch it go downstream like a little boat. And then my dad looked down to me and he said, "Goes, that's going to end up in the ocean someday." And I didn't understand right away. And then he says, "Yep, this little brook, it'll empty into the Saranac River. And then from the Saranac River, it'll empty into Lake Champlain. And from Lake Champlain down the Richelieu River to the St. Lawrence out into the ocean." And even, it struck me as a little kid that stick someday is going to end up somewhere else. And the stick is harmless, but that made me aware of there's certain things like that are harmful to the environment that humans, maybe not on purpose, but accidentally ends up in the waterways, and that ultimately affects a different water body. And so I met Curt and we talked about it. And so I designed this painting. And the subject of this painting is a young Native woman, and she has cupped in her hands some water, and that water is filtering through her fingers. And the idea is that whatever we touch as humans sometimes ends up somewhere else. And certain times it can be harmful to other places. And around this young woman, all the foliage, the leaves, the trees, the grasses, I designed it in such a way where it is a mosaic, almost like little dabs of paint that would create the illusion of foliage. And then with each dab of paint, I would go in and circle each one with a different color. And I'd put in a Haudenosaunee design, whether it be a wampum belt or beadwork or quill work. And then talking with Curt, I asked him what pollutants end up in Lake Champlain and what happens. Explain it to me. And he actually sent me images of molecular formulas for certain things like phosphorus and different pollutants, the salts that end up in the water. And what they do create a lot of times is the algae in Lake Champlain, especially during the summer, those hot summer days where the sun beats down and you get these algae blooms where they warn people not to go into the water and even keep their pets away from the water. And it has harmful effects. And so within that mosaic, in that painting, I have certain scientific diagrams of these pollutants and also the different algae that end up. And so it's a mosaic contained within this one painting that tells the story of the science behind the problem. And so that was our first collaboration. And then, and Curt can talk about this a little more, is that when this topic came up of people not being in the Adirondacks, Indigenous people, we decided to write a book about it. And so how we approached it was using an old wampum belt among the Haudenosaunee is called the two-row wampum. And very briefly, the two-row wampum is an agreement between two peoples, one of which being the Haudenosaunee. And later, it was the Dutch, the English, and ultimately the Americans. And there are two rows of purple wampum beads going down this belt. And one row represents the Haudenosaunee in our canoes paddling down the river of life. And contained within that canoe is everything about us. our language, our laws, our spiritual beliefs, everything is contained within that canoe, paddling down the river of life. And next to us, the other row started with the Dutch and ultimately the Americans in their ship. Everything about them is in their ship, their language, their laws, their customs, their spiritual beliefs are all contained within that ship, sailing down that same river of life. And those two paths are parallel. They never interfere with each other. They never try to steer the other boat. In between them is white wampum beads, and that white wampum represents peace and friendship. And so we maintain that relationship with the Americans. Even today, we hold on to that agreement. And part of this agreement is that if we ever need help in any way, we can call upon our friends, the Americans, to help us. If they need help, they can call on us and we can help them. And so that relationship of peaceful coexistence still holds true to us. And so Curt and I approach this book in a similar fashion. My role is as a Mohawk artist, a storyteller. And my friend Curt, he's approaching this book as a scientist. And I like how he says a nerdy scientist. I don't think he's that nerdy. He's pretty cool. But we were going down that same river, Curt and I, and we talked about this book and we addressed this issue. And that just gives you an overall sense of how this came about. And with that, I'll pass it on over to Curt.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. Yeah, that's such a beautiful metaphor, the two-row wampum, and it really works well for us. I'm going to share the screen here and have some photos for you. Just get this running. Take a second. Okay, I'm going to ask someone to just speak up. Let me know if you can hear me and if you can see the slide, and then I'll get going.
All good, Curt.
Okay. So Dave and I have been doing projects together for quite a while, and first really serious one that has to do with this topic tonight was about 10 years ago. Began when my parents turned 80. They came up to visit, and in the midst of the celebrations, I suggested we go visit the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center. So we did, and Dave's father, John, was there at the time. I brought my father, and so we had a great time looking at it. It's just a fantastic place, really interesting. And one thing caught my father's eye. It was a dugout canoe sitting on the floor in the corner of one of the rooms. And he asked John Fadden, how old is that? And he said, well, we know it's from the bottom of Lake Placid, but we don't know how old it is because we haven't had the resources to have it radiocarbon dated. So my father turned to me and said, well, Curt, you're doing research projects that do carbon-14 dating. Why don't you have it dated? So I said, okay. And then John turned to Dave and said, well, why don't you help Curt sample the wood in the canoe? And Dave said, oh, okay. So here's a photo of us with the dugout canoe from Lake Placid, and we drilling a hole into it to take a sample from the middle where the wood wouldn't be contaminated, and we sent it off to a lab. And the age came back about 200 years, which is way younger than we were thinking. And truth be told, we were hoping it was going to be much, much older than that, sort of for the romance of it. But there was another reason, too, why we wanted it. We were hoping it was going to be older because that would help tell us who made it. It turns out people used dugout canoes for the last several centuries at a time when both Indigenous and Euro-American people were here, and they both used dugouts. And so the age alone wouldn't tell you necessarily who made it. So we thought, well, gosh, maybe we're going to find some really old one too. So we expanded the project and found out the information about every single dugout we could find in the Adirondacks. And we visited them and measured them and got carbon-14 dates for the ones that hadn't been dated. So here's the oldest one that we know of from the Adirondacks. There were actually two of these found in Twin Ponds, which is between Malone and the Paul Smiths area. There was some dredging being done by the landowner for development, and the dredge operator pulled this thing out of the wetland with his machine. And it's 18 feet long. And when we got a carbon-14 date for that, it came out to about 500 years old, which is very, very early in the what we would call the post-contact phase. So just by the age alone, it's likely that it was made by indigenous people. But in addition to that, we could tell because the wood is charred and blackened, which is one of the methods that was used to hollow out the dugouts. And there is no sign of sharp metal tools cutting it. It's most likely done with stone or bone tools like that. So this sort of set the stage for the project that we've summarized in the book. And before I give you some more of the evidence that we have for this long indigenous presence, I want to introduce you to this idea. If you're not familiar with it, as Dave said, it's an idea that's prevalent up here in the highlands, which we define as anything above 1,000 feet elevation. People know that folks lived for thousands of years down in the St. Lawrence Valley, Champlain Valley, but up in the mountains, the narrative was the indigenous people didn't really live up here. And if you talk to people on the street or anywhere in the communities up here, people will give several standard reasons for why it seems to make sense to say that. So one of the arguments is, well, the climates here are too brutal. They couldn't handle the terrible winters up here. Or it was too hard to grow crops up here, so there was no way for them to make a living. So they stayed in the lowlands and avoided the uplands, which couldn't grow anything. Or there was just nothing up here for them. Why would they come up if you couldn't grow crops or do these other things? Too brutal a landscape. And if there were any people up here, they were only passing through. So we're going to deconstruct these rationales one by one, but I do want to point out that they're not only incorrect, as we'll show you, but there's a harmful corollary to this, which is that these kinds of arguments were used for something else, and that was for the taking of the land around the time of the American Revolution. And one of the explicit criteria was that this was abandoned, empty land. So let's check these out. They're not correct, and you actually don't need a lot of archaeological evidence to deconstruct most of these. Like, for example, the idea that climates are too brutal up here. Well, of course, stop and think about it. Folks live all the way up into the high Arctic now, and they have for thousands of years, and no one questions that. So if people can live in a harsher climate than this, why couldn't they live up here? And of course, there is evidence of people living in high country elsewhere in the country too. So it just doesn't hold up. And people had adaptations for lodging and clothing and how to live in super cold weather. Then there's this idea of it's no good for crops. And I've heard this repeatedly, including from local residents who I know for a fact regularly drive past the great Adirondack corn maze in Gabriel's near Paul Smith's, right? So corn absolutely does grow up here. In fact, I have a photo to prove it. The one over on the right is a maize field there at Gabriel's, and the mountain behind that is St. Regis Mountain. So there are lots of reasons besides that that the argument doesn't hold water. It's first of all, the people who did agriculture back then had genetic strains of these crops that were perfectly capable of growing in our climate and on our kinds of soils. They're just not the ones that people are using today. But even so, it's a moot point because you can see the crops growing here nowadays. But there's a bigger reason why this argument is not really useful, because agriculture was only the most recent chapter in a much, much longer story. Most people never did cropping. It was mostly the Haudenosaunee folks, and yes, mainly down in the lowlands, but it was perfectly possible to grow the crops up here. So to sort of build on that, you can kind of get into this next claim that there was nothing here for them. especially if you couldn't grow crops, which we now know wasn't true. But there's plenty to live on up here. And that's the way most people lived for thousands of years before agriculture, which is heavy use of agriculture here in this part of the continent was maybe the last 1,000 years, give or take. So there actually is plenty to make a living with up here. If we go kind of in a clockwise around the pictures, upper left, you've got plenty of material to make lodging with. Over on the right, of course, Indigenous people invented maple syrup harvesting. They invented snowshoes for getting around in the snow. Lower right, there are plenty of animals for hunting year round. And on the lower left, there are fish in the streams and the lakes year round, even in the winter. If you're hungry and want some fresh fish, all you have to do is chop a hole in the ice and there are fish down there to eat underfoot. So there's plenty of food and shelter and materials for the things you need. There absolutely is plenty up here to live on. And people back then knew how to do that. Then this idea of, well, okay, they were there, but they were only passing through, doesn't hold water once you start looking at the archaeology. So on the right, we have the other one of the two old canoes from Twin Ponds. This is in the owner's home. And these are gigantic. They would not be used for getting to and from Twin Ponds because the outlet stream from that pond is much, much too small to handle watercraft, much less an 18-foot monster or this one right here. So these were made to be used in Twin Ponds. And they take a long time to make. You don't need them to cross the pond. It's very small, so you could walk around it if you want to get around it. These were made for repeated long-term use on the ponds. So over on the left, we have a picture of Dave's grandfather, Ray Kanietakeron Fadden, and he's holding a beautiful Haudenosaunee pot that was found in a rock shelter at Silver Lake Mountain. And pottery is not easy to carry around in a fast trek across the Adirondacks. So why would you carry something like this if you're just rushing to get from one place to another, crossing over the mountains, or you're just on a hunting trip? And so they're fragile, they're heavy, they're found all over the park, and most likely they were made by women more than by men. And so that would suggest family life more than a quick, bunch of hunting buddies crossing the area quickly. So these kinds of evidence are also very strong evidence for long-term occupation in these places. So I'll give you a little bit of the archaeology and then we'll open up to questions in a minute. But there are a few archaeologists who do work in the area, not nearly as much as in other parts of New York State, which is one of the reasons we haven't had this kind of evidence. The most prominent one we talked to is Tim Messner at SUNY Potsdam. And some years ago, he invited me and my wife, Carrie, to go visit one of the sites he was working on with his students down at Long Lake. And so we showed up, and here in the lawn was this pit that he and his students had dug in someone's backyard near the lake. And he points down in there and says, "Isn't that wonderful?" And I thought, well, it looks like a bunch of rocks. He said, "No, well, yeah, but it's FCR. So then he explained that FCR is fire cracked rock. And I said, okay, well, that's interesting. And then he said, it's a hearth, which to me sounds like a fireplace and, a cook stove or something. But what he meant was that in the days before metal pots and pans, people would use a skin bag, a stomach from a large animal, maybe even pottery. You heat cobbles up until they're red hot in a fire. And then you pick them up with sticks and you drop them in whatever you're cooking, and it boils the water and cooks them very quickly. So these are cooking stones. And so I said, well, that's really interesting. Is that people were cooking here a long time ago. How long ago was that? And he said, we don't know. We don't have the resources to get carbon-14 dating. So we invested in that, and we found out that this site is 1,000 years old. People were cooking a meal on the shore of Long Lake 1,000 years ago when the Vikings were settling Greenland. So archaeologists can oftentimes recognize the age of things even if they don't have direct carbon-14 dates. A lot of the technology, the stone tools, arrowheads, spear points, dart points, things like that, can be recognized by their style of their handiwork. And so there's a standard process whereby if you find these items here in the park, you can look them up in the standard manuals and tell how old. So these are some from the Fulton chain that are about 5,000 years old. And we find items like that all over the park as well. So that's about the time of the Egyptian pyramids. The oldest artifacts that we're sure of are projectile points that were on spears. And this is one of the oldest definite ones known. This is from Tupper Lake. It's 12,000 years old. It's called a fluted point because there's a groove at the base. It's very difficult to make. It's a special style of projectile point, and the groove was there to help attach it to a dart. And then it was thrown at the prey with a throwing stick here called an atlatl, and probably hunting caribou would be the thing. So that's a long time. This is way before agriculture, when people were just living off the land, moving around from place to place wherever the resources were whenever they needed it. So to combine that with the kind of work I do with environmental history, we know from sediment cores from the Adirondacks that at that time, 12,000 years ago, 13,000 when the ice had just left, there were no big forests here. The pollen grains in the lake sediments show us that there was what we call tundra. It was grasslands, herbs, shrubs, maybe a few little trees in the background. These are the kinds of critters you would find there. We know for sure we had muskox because a bone was found down near Elizabethtown. Very likely there were caribou, possibly even mastodons and mammoth. But the point here is people were here when the Adirondacks looked like this. So they were here before the forests. And another way to say it is the human presence here is older than the trees. So it's kind of the reverse of what a lot of us have been saying for many years, that these woods are naturally wild without people in them. Actually, it's the trees who are the newcomers. So I'll just be wrapping up here. This this map on the left is a picture of the uplands. The light color is the high country. These red dots are all places where Dave and I have compiled accounts of or found ourselves items of any kind dating back thousands of years all over the park. There's about 36 of them in here. So again, the point is the people who lived here considered this whole region to be their home. They moved freely over it, just like we move freely from room to room in our own homes, kind of trapped in our little structures there. For them, their home was the entire region. And so just because they moved around on it certainly does not mean they did not live here. And if you look around, the remains are still here. You'll find in a beautiful campsite like here on Lower Saranac Lake. If you look through the pine needles on the ground, sometimes you'll find a little flake of flint or chert that somebody had left behind while they were sharpening one of their tools. So thank you for letting us give you this introduction, and I think we'll open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Curt and Dave. And just a reminder, we have a huge audience tonight, so we'll get to audience questions as quickly as we can. We'll try to work them in as I moderate the discussion. But if you do have a question, just jot it into the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll try to take them as they come in. But I guess I wanted to start with just a broad question for both of you. Obviously, to read this book is to grasp that we have gotten the story wrong for a long time. What do you think has been the bigger kind of societal impact of that error?
Dave, you want to take it?
Sure. I think and Curt touched on this a bit, was that when you describe a place as void of humans, that justifies them taking it. basically stealing it. And I think that, when you do that to any group of people, it's pretty harmful, just to, you erase their history, you erase their presence on this continent, really. And I think it's just a matter of reclaiming the truth, just say, well, wait a minute, I think there's more to the story. And hopefully what this book will help generate is more interest, with different archaeologists. Maybe there's folks have a collection in their homes. Maybe they could bring that to our awareness, and we can learn more from it. And like I said, the artifacts that we have in our collection, a number of them are just found by accident, or pretty much all of them. I was a random hunter, the Silver Lake Mountain, ducked into a rock shelter when it was raining, and he found that pottery bowl just by accident. I think a guy named Jim Bickford, he just was exploring around the base of St. Regis Mountain, and he found this little area, and he put his hand in there and he pulled out pottery shards. Curt just met a guy from Saranac Lake who was riding around on his bike, and he right behind where Curt currently lives in Saranac Lake. And as a young boy, he found this projectile point, and it's been in his sock drawer for I know decades. And so who knows what's out there already. And my dad went to a conference years ago, and it was an archaeologist from Vermont, and he was giving a presentation, and he put up this map of the area. You have Vermont, Lake Champlain, in New York State, including the Adirondacks. And on this map were all these little dots, especially on the Vermont side, in the Green Mountains, of different sites, digs, all over the place. And it was concentrated near water, which is understandable. Then on the New York side, in the Adirondacks, there's hardly anything. And if you think about it, the Green Mountains are very similar to the Adirondacks. Of course, I'm a little biased. I think the Adirondacks are nice. I don't want to make anybody mad, but they always used to say the best thing about the Green Mountains is the view of the Adirondacks. But I won't get into that. But anyways, my father posed a question, why is that? And the archaeologist simply said that, they look in their own backyard, and he's from University of Vermont. They just didn't have the resources to trek over to the mountains and look around. So, but that doesn't say we weren't there. It's harder to prove that.
Well, and Curt, so much of science is about questioning assumptions, and it seems like either people weren't doing that for a long time, or they were questioning the wrong assumptions.
Yeah. The main thing was the information wasn't there. And of course, people have been interested in the Adirondacks for a long time. And so books would be written without enough information to make valid claims. And then because the books have been here for a long time, people take them as gospel. So a lot of archaeology was done about 100 years ago, but it was around the region, not up here. When you're digging cellar holes for houses, plowing fields, building roads, you come across things. And here it's covered with trees. So and now with the park, of course, it's harder to do that. So we'll probably never get as much stuff here because we like to keep the land the way it is. But the things are absolutely here, and a lot of them are underwater. We dammed a lot of the lakes, and so when the levels come up, they flood the shorelines where a lot of the people were staying. And so we're pretty sure some of the stuff is still here. Like the Tupper Lake one was found because the lake level was dropped to work on the dam, and archaeologists went exploring and found things like that.
We have lots of very good questions already in the Q&A section, so let me get to as many of them as we can in kind of as short an order as we can. And Dave, the first one is probably the easiest one of all, and that is from Mary, who wants to know, when will the museum in Ontario open this year?
July 1st is our official opening day, but we usually open in June to different groups, and If I happen to be around, you pull in, and I have the key, so I'll let you in. And then we open through Labor Day.
Great. Don has two questions that are sort of related, so let me ask them both. One is, does the scientific research that has been done provide clues as to how the Adirondack landscape will look on 1,000 years from now? And he also wants to know if Haudenosaunee prophecies speak of how our environment will change and how we can adapt to the changes.
Hmm.
So I guess it's a question for each of you.
All right. Well, I'll do the nerdy science one first then. The big question, of course, if we talk 1,000 years in the future, is going to be, what do we do? And of course, the Adirondack Park is protected by laws we have now, but they can be changed. So it's all going to be, as the generations come along, how are they going to take care of the land? So let's assume that there's still a park in 1,000 years. With the climate models, we can be pretty sure there won't be winter as we know it. And the warming effects are going to last many thousands of years. So it won't be a desert by any means. It'll be more like the Blue Ridge. So we won't have Winter Olympics 1,000 years from now. We'll have maybe Olympics, but not Winter Olympics. So that's going to be the biggest effect, is losing snow and ice.
You also do make the point in the book, however, that the warming that we're experiencing now is kind of a blip, if you will, that really we're looking at a climate that is going to get colder over time, like geologically.
Yeah, but it's a big blip.
Yeah.
So in the geologic scale, what we think of as long history is a blip, but the warming phase will go on for centuries. And what we might call a cooling phase, but is actually just a return to normal while it's still hotter, but becoming less hotter, is going to be tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
So long term, we've made a warmer planet for a very long time.
And Dave, Haudenosaunee prophecies about what the future might be like and how we can adapt.
Well, one comes to mind where it talks about things to watch, as the generations go on. And one of them is that the trees start dying from the tops down. The fish die. There's no more fish. One of them describes that the water catches fire. Those are obvious signs to be wary of. And they don't say that it's the end of things, end of days. It's more or less, it's going to be hard, very difficult. In that, why the emphasis is learning how to survive in a terrain where you have these hardships. Learn the old skills like our ancestors knew. They could live anywhere. I could, myself personally, I couldn't live in the Arctic very long. I don't have the skills, but if I go there and learn, I would adapt eventually. It's not necessarily a scary thing, but it's more or less getting back to the old traditions of, the knowledge of the plants that you can eat and how you can adapt to change. And one of the parts of this story, it talks about that people will move higher, go up into the mountains. So
we can't see the audience members, as you pointed out, Dave. It would have been nice to see, and there are a lot of them. We can't see the audience members who have joined us for the event, but based on the questions that are coming in, I'm imagining that a lot of people are listening and kind of nodding in agreement about a lot of what the two of you have been talking about, which I imagine is exactly what you hope for. But who else would you think would benefit most from reading this? In a way, the fact that we have, like 200 people means that these are people whose minds are already open to hearing what you have to say. Who out there needs to take the lessons from this book?
I'll jump in again if you want. Yeah. I'm just so thrilled and honored to be doing this with Dave, and doing it the way we've done it, as a true collaboration, again, with this 2-row thing. Here I am, almost 70 years old, and I just love having my mind changed. When I first moved here decades ago, I was believing the original canon, and it never crossed my mind that this much was missing. And my preconception of this place, which is still partly true, it's this beautiful mountain landscape. And as a younger person, you think of it as maybe a playground, place to recreate yourself, and a place of healing. But the assumption was that people don't belong here of any kind. We're all visitors. And so we have these wilderness areas that are only charming because people are not living in them. But in fact, as you get to know the place more, you start to remember hearing, yes, it's a 6 million acre park and half of it is privately owned. And it's got people living in it. And it's actually part of the magic is that it's people living on the land without destroying it and being in love with it. So that was the next step. But then the next thing is, but then there's many kinds of people. And they've been doing this for a long, long time. And it's not just an abstraction, but people are more native to this place than the trees. It's just mind-boggling and wonderful to just have the blinders taken off and say, oh, good, we've been waiting for these latest chapters in our story, and here's some of them.
A couple of questions that ask about some scientific phenomena. One from Gerald, who wants to know what actually caused the evolution from the more tundra-like landscape to forest land.
Mm-hmm. Tilt of the Earth and orbital cycles, what you call the natural cycles of the Earth that make ice ages come in and go. So the northern hemisphere got warmer and warmer summers, start melting the ice. Then you start having the clear summer-winter cycles, and that changes the kinds of plants.
Well, and James asks a similar kind of question. He wants to know, how long ago was it that the ice actually retreated from the Adirondacks, and how soon after that did people move into the area? Which you can find out by reading the book.
You can find out by reading the book, and more than you want to know probably. But the quick version is roughly 13,000 years ago. Most of it was ice-free. The projectile points, that particular one is 12,000 years old. But with the habitat here, with the critters here, all the resources here, and people all over the Northeast at that time, personally, I would be stunned if there weren't people as soon as the ice left.
Dave, there's a question about the Turo wampum belt from Laura, who says she wonders what type of shell was used for Haudenosaunee wampum. Was it the quahog from a coastal area, or was there a closer source?
Yeah, the primary wampum makers were along the coast. The Narragansetts, the Wampanoag, Pequots. It was made from the quahog shell, and they also used the whelk. And it was traded inland. And one of the misconceptions, another misconception is that it was money. The Dutch turned it into money. Prior to European, we didn't have money, it didn't exist. What we also didn't have was poverty, but that didn't exist. We didn't have jails, we didn't have theft, things like that. We learned that from Europe. But when it was traded and bartered, with the knowledge that it takes a lot of time and effort to make one bead, you can get a lot of things for it. And there was a vast trade network. We had an economy too. We traded with people. And another misconception is that we were always fighting, always at war. And that just simply isn't true. And, in our political structure, it's called the Kanietakeron, or the Great Law of Peace. It's how do you establish peace and use diplomacy to settle your differences. I think right now the United States should adhere to that part. That's another webinar. But anyways, they would find in certain digs in New York State, they found shark's teeth in one site. As far as I know, there's no sharks in the Adirondacks or anywhere else in New York State. And they found obsidian from Labrador, way up north. And down in Florida, they had those, they call them shell middens. They're big stacks of shells. They did a dig through there, and they found Haudenosaunee pottery from New York State. So we didn't stay in one place. We got around and traded and met other people. And when you meet other people, you learn new technologies and new things, new stories. You share.
John would like to know, he says, colonial maps referred to today's Adirondack region as one filled with, quote, swamps and drowned lands. To what extent is this accurate or inaccurate?
Yeah, I guess I'll take it. Well, remember back in the colonial days, they didn't have GPS, they didn't have satellites, drones, they didn't have roads, careful mapping. And they also didn't have population census data, which is another reason why they thought there was no one here. So yeah, the main highways were waterways. So you would go up rivers, and if that's the experience these folks had, they would have gone up rivers. And yes, there are certainly flowed land rivers. But anybody who knows the landscape, it's rugged, and there's plenty of dry ground around here too.
Yeah. Couple of questions about archaeology. Can you tell us, this is Jim asking, can you tell us a little about the finds from when the Piercefield flow was partially drained and an archaeological dig took place?
Sure. You jump into if you want, Dave, with any of these. I'm just going into it. But that fluted point we showed you from Tupper Lake was from that excavation. So people walk the shorelines, and there are professionals who do that. They're brought in as professional archaeologists when there's an opportunity, and they'll survey and check things like that. So the collection is down at SUNY Binghamton, and others are in the State Museum in Albany.
What would you want people to do who run across an object that they find? Because as you describe it in the book, they're kind of all over the place, and you could easily be camping or hiking or just exploring and run across a projectile point or a tool of some kind.
Yeah. Dave, you want to?
I think, when people find an object, like in an indigenous perspective, what we do is we leave it there. We leave it alone. But I'm curious too, though. And so I would like people to take note of where they found it and how they found it, the date, all the information they can about this particular item. Because if you just take it, put it in a shoebox, and then your kids find it later on, maybe after you passed away, they'll say, "Where's this from?" They have no clue. And then so that knowledge is gone. So at the very least, record it. And then if you happen to be in Aunt Iota, I'll take it off your hands.
Of course, everybody has a phone with them. They could take a picture of it and document it pretty closely.
Yeah. The folks at the State Museum in Albany make that clear. They know a lot of folks would like to keep the thing, and if it's on private land, it's perfectly legal. You can't take things from state land, but they said even if you did find something at a state campsite, exactly what you said, Mitch, you take a photo, give the coordinates, and then look up who to write to at the museum and say, this was found there. And they probably won't ask you a lot of questions, but we'll thank you, because if you get a good picture of it, you can often tell the age.
We still have a few more questions. We might go a little bit past 8 o'clock with your permission. Judith writes, I've recently read that the Haudenosaunee have acquired 600 acres of the Adirondacks to be returned to the care of the Indigenous people in the area. Can you please speak to this?
Yeah, it was quite a big event in our little cultural center, in that it started way back in 2020 when we became a not-for-profit, and I always described it as like the stars were aligned and all these things started happening. And one of the things that happened is that the land to our west came up for sale in 2021, I believe, 333 acres. And it was right after COVID, and we opened up the following summer, and I met a woman who worked for the Adirondack Land Trust. And after a discussion, I wasn't sure what they did, the land trust, and they said they buy property for preservation. And so I says, I know where there's some land. And so we worked together, we partnered together, and we raised the funds, and we purchased the 300 acres in 2022. And then 2 years ago, I met a lady at the museum Peg Olson, who works for the Nature Conservancy, and she indicated to me that the land to our east, over 600 acres, owned by Paul Smith College, was up for sale. Here we go again. And so they did some fundraising, and it was, I think, 1.1 million because there are buildings on this property, and we closed on the property March 9th, and they transferred ownership to the cultural center. And so we have over 900 acres, and it's now under Haudenosaunee care. And as part of our working together, the land trusts and the Nature Conservancy, we're developing a conservation easement, but it's a little different in that we're approaching it like the two-row. On one side of the document is our version and our how we take care of the land in our language, in our words, our terminology. On the other side of the document is Adirondack Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy and their ways of taking care of the land. And so this document is going to be called a conservation covenant. And so we're again approaching it like the two-row, these two entities. And the thing that we share is the love of the land. And we want to protect it and preserve it for the future. And so it just, I'm almost pinching myself that this is real. And so now we have this property that's under our care. And we have exciting summer ahead where we're going to invite experts to come onto the site and to do a bio blitz. And they'll be in the end of July to see what's on the property in terms of food plants, medicine plants, animal habitation, just to document and develop a trail system on this property that will avoid the more sensitive areas. And so it's really, really exciting. And we had a Native youth camp. This will be the official home of this youth camp. And I'm working with another organization that has a camp with the local school districts, Saranac Lake, Tupper Lake up to Plattsburgh, where they can come and experience the land that I was very fortunate to have grown up in. So it's really, really exciting.
I'll jump in here too and say if anybody has any loose change in their pockets, if it's not millions, but something, there's going to be just wonderful programming. And this is now the ground floor of this. And if you do want to support programs like Dave's going to be starting, I would urge you to contact him.
A couple of almost yes/no questions here from Jennifer, who asks, are chert and flint found throughout the park? And is the canoe that you showed in your presentation, Curt, hollowed from a cedar tree?
The Lake Placid dugout cedar. Pretty sure the big ones from Twin Ponds are white pine. Chert or flint are found through the park, but only where people dropped it. It's granitic stuff, anorthosite, and then glacial sand and gravel. There might be a chunk or two that came in from Canada on the ice. But that, again, just the very presence of a flint flake or a chert flake shows you that people were there a long time ago.
Yeah. Kathy asks, your collaboration uniquely sits at the literal intersection of art and science, where clearly a friendship has formed. Is there another opportunity for collaboration forming between the two of you, and what might that look like?
Take the lead there, Dave.
I don't know yet. I'm still floating on this book here. We'll see. Maybe you could get music involved somehow.
Yeah.
Because Curt's also an excellent musician, and
well, and judging from the crowd that's joined us tonight, more popular than the Beatles.
Well, I'll jump in and say the two-row thing is exactly what Dave said. I mean, it's just so wonderful and unique. The whole approach, it's what you call land back, right? Returning the land to Indigenous stewardship. Dave is just really careful, thoughtful, and collaborative about how to do this. And the Paul Smith College, where I work, is ready, eager, willing to be a resource if we ever need to be asked. And we'll be involved with things like maybe helping staff the center there in the summer, or help with programming or trails or ecology stuff too. But this is Dave and his associates are driving the bus here. So we're going to be in parallel and ready to see once you get your feet under you and you get a really good sense of what you've got there. We're here to help.
Well, and I wanted to finish up with one more question for Dave, and that is, as you think about your family, your father and your grandfather's lifetimes of work in preserving the history and culture of your family's people, how do you think, say, your grandfather would view this book, and how our collective knowledge and understanding are changing?
Oh, he would be extremely pleased, I'm sure. The work that he did was just phenomenal. If you ever get a chance to visit the museum, this is a day back before computers. He has informational charts, and he was just dedicated to preserving the history and teaching. He was an excellent teacher, and I just kind of followed along the footsteps. And as a little kid, I just listened to him and my father tell stories to visitors, and those questions come up, and I was just always listening. And then just a funny story is that I think I was about 17 was the first time I told a story at the museum. And if you're not familiar, my grandfather would use these, we call them pictographic record belts. And it was belts that he made out of what they call seed beads. They're real small, but he'd do pictographs, and it was a form of writing per se. He would tell stories to just about everyone who visited. Even if it was one person, he'd sit them down and tell them a story. And so he had that dedication and that passion. And that one day, I'll never forget it. He looked over at me and he says, "Why don't you tell these people a story?" He goes, "I'm tired." He goes, "I don't feel too good." And I was like, and I never told a story in my life. And so I reluctantly said, "Okay." And I said, "Grandpa, you got to leave the room though." He was like, "You make me nervous. He's the guru." And so he left, and the people sat down on the benches, and I proceeded to tell the story. It was awful. It was horrible. But what I realized is I knew it. It was up here. I just had to work on a delivery. So about halfway through the story, I got a whiff of his pipe. He used to smoke a pipe. So I knew he was close proximity and within earshot. That made me more nervous. But I finished the story. And afterwards, he came around the corner and he just looked at me and gave me a pat on the shoulder. And so that's how I became a storyteller. And I'm sure he'd give me a pat, and Curt a pat on the shoulder too.
Well, I think everyone who's joined us is giving you a metaphorical pat on the shoulder. Dave Fadden and Curt Stager, it's been a real honor talking with you both. So many positive comments in the Q&A. I wish we could get to every single question, but lots of people seem very grateful for the conversation tonight. And with that, let me turn things back over to Liz Bellier at the Adirondack Experience.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We so enjoyed that conversation, and thank you to Curt and Dave and Mitch for spending their evening with us. And as we look ahead, we invite you to join us for the final installment of this season of In the Adirondack Library on Monday, May 4th, when we welcome Terrence Young to discuss his book, Heading Out, A History of American Camping. And if you're looking to join us in person, we would love to see you this Thursday, April 9th, for Taps and Trivia at Bandstand Brewworks in Warrensburg from 6 to 8 p.m. Our Adirondack themed trivia nights bring together history, good company, and just a bit of friendly competition. I may be a bit biased as the trivia host, but I do think that these are some really, really fun events to come out to, so we'd love to see you there. There is much ahead this spring, and we encourage you to visit the80kx.org for the full schedule of programs and events. On behalf of all of us at the Adirondack Experience, I'm Liz Bellier. Thank you for spending your evening with us from Blue Mountain Lake to wherever you may be watching. We wish you a good night, and until next time.